My talk follows on quite well from Ray McGrath's and more particularly Ian's presentation relating to resilience. We've done a bit of exploratory studies on Bray relating to those issues such as insurance, responsibility, flood awareness, attitudes to risk. More generally, it's more an overview presentation of just some of the issues we looked at. But firstly, just going to look a little bit of context from a European perspective, Ireland, the way policy has moved over recent years, and then looking at those issues that we examined in Bray in a little bit of detail. It's more an overview though. So globally, about 3.4 billion people are exposed to one or more natural hazards, and that's hazards of all sorts. So whether it's climatological, meteorological, landslides, avalanches, any of those storms, all related. Perception is that there's increasing number of events. As Ian said, these are all increasing number of events, rising costs. Are these simply explained by increased awareness? If you hooked up to Twitter last year, you could have got live feeds from the floods in Brisbane, for example. So is there just increased awareness of events because the world has got smaller, or is there actually more events? Increasing impact of climate change. As Ian referred to, and Ray also, there's two recent studies from Nature that have identified climate change associated with increasing episodes of flooding occurring over recent years. So 1998 to 2009 saw just over 900 major events recorded, natural hazard events. A natural hazard event being, or major event being, at least 10 fatalities or 100 people recorded affected, or a declaration of a state of emergency. So that's what a major event is categorised as under this European database. So 2009, so 928 events, 100,000 fatalities nearly. Losses of 148 billion. Of those, only 36 billion were insured losses, and that's just Europe. Of those, 213 were flood events, so major flood events. Fatalities were 1,100, but the losses financially were a very significant proportion of those greater natural hazard events, 52 billion euro in losses, and 12 billion of that only insured losses. So looking closer to home, more recently over the last few years, we saw a number of summer floods in 2008, so localised flooding in Dublin, Wicklow, Wexford, along the east and the Midlands, major flooding in Carlow, Newcastle West and Mallow in particular towns. 2009, then we saw more regionally widespread flooding, particularly arising from the Shannon and the Lee. So just pictures here, Partine Weir in Brereton, Athlone, Cork city centre flooded, Ballinasloe extensively flooded, and Mallow quite extensively flooded throughout the town centre. And then we saw flooding this year again in 2000, or just the last few months before Christmas. Rather than river flooding, a lot of that was more localised surface water issues, in addition to some episodes of river-related flooding. But the total identified cost of the 2009 floods in Ireland was 520 million, so €500 million. 276 related to the costs to the state, so damage to roads, damage to infrastructure, provision of temporary accommodation, costs incurred by the various emergency services. So that's the cost directly to the taxpayer in terms of what was financially assessed. And then 244 million consisting of damage to private infrastructure and covered by private insurance. So the estimated total cost of 520 million. But this excludes all those uninsured impacts and the costs associated, and any of the non-monetary social costs, so the psychological effects, for example, that we have a talk later on that particular related issue. So the costs can be quite extensive. There's a couple of government reports arising from the episodes of extreme events. One was flooding, the other, slightly different, was the extreme cold freeze we experienced as well. So these identified the importance of communications, preparedness and emergency planning in response to those various extreme events. And I would say in general, historically, engineers have had a strong overview of flooding issues and have taken a strong lead on their research, generally being a lack of interest from social scientists until recently, now that the impacts have become more apparent, more frequent, or maybe awareness has increased. So generally there's been a lack of socioeconomic analysis of flooding in Ireland in any way, in any event, a bit more analysis of it in a European perspective. So lack of analysis of its impact on people and on people's views of different policy responses beyond those structural solutions that we're more familiar with. So as Ray has already said, Ireland is already facing an increased likelihood of environmental hazards due to climate change. So environmental hazards may be extremes in temperature, extremes in precipitation, or extremes in winds and storms. And the risks are likely to increase over time due to climate change. So there's a number of policy responses that we can undertake to address flooding and reduce the impact. So we can introduce various forms of insurance to spread the losses. So the losses are shared by wider society for example, if you have a public insurance or government-led insurance scheme. Plan for the losses by raising awareness amongst people of risk, and that relief is only possible through private household level insurance. Or we can encourage people to just simply bear the losses. Individuals and companies bear the losses and cope as best as they can. So we try and mitigate those losses by trying to essentially spread them or be prepared for the loss. Or we can undertake what has been the traditional response to flooding, protection. So develop flood relief schemes, so modify the risk by reducing the probability of damage through structural solutions. So at a macro level, so community level flood relief schemes, like what Finbar was going to talk about in a few minutes, that's occurring or will occur in Bray, or micro level protection at the household level, so household level resistance and or resilience measures that we also investigated in Bray. Then finally, adaptation, and a lot of attention has been paid to this over the last few years in terms of climate change. So climate change adaptation. So modifying the loss potential by reducing the consequences through primarily non-structural means. So instead of trying to address the probability or reducing the probability of flooding or intervene to introduce a threshold under which you're protected from flooding, try and introduce a mechanism to reduce the consequences through increasing flood awareness and preparedness, introducing early warning systems, emergency plans, land use planning, household level resilience measures. And I was at a talk in the UK where one of the experts in flood risk management in the London area in the Environment Agency, he was asked what was success. So we're going to develop these various mechanisms to ensure that in future developments are safe. They may still flood, but developments will be safe. And someone asked, well, what is safe? And essentially the answer was, well, there'll be no fatalities. And everyone is able to, no one gets wet feet, but really it's about minimising fatalities. People's houses may flood, people's properties may flood, but people are able to safely escape, they're warned in time and they're aware of the dangers. And at a household level, really we minimise the impact on people, focusing on people rather than property. That's one perspective, but that's the kind of agenda that has been increased over the last few years because of the costs of trying to protect properties. So the new policies are focusing on resilience, more so on resilience than on prevention, with increased attention on flood warnings, public perceptions of flood risk and flood risk awareness. To date, there's been very little research, or some research, but not extensively, on public engagement and on perceptions and attitudes to flood risk. More extensive work has been done on social vulnerability, primarily amongst sociologists, so why people locate in particular locations and what makes them vulnerable. So we did an exploratory case study in Bray, not on the structural elements, but on the non-structural socio-economic issues that we believe people would be interested in, and that people should be concerned with who live in an area that is at flood risk. So Bray, for those of you who are not familiar, located in North East County Wicklow, 12 miles south of Dublin, population of 27,000, located on the Dargle River, and it has a coastal location, so it's exposed to some fluvial flood risks and tidal risk, and also coastal flood risk. We focus entirely on the fluvial risks. So there's been 4 major flood events in Bray during the last century: 1905, 1931, 1965, 1986, and some less significant events in 1947, 1958, and arguably in the last few months as well there was some minor episode. So flooding in Bray occurs with an approximate average of once in every 25 to 30 years. Hurricane Charlie, which was the most recent significant event, had a return period of between approximately 50 and 100 years in the low-lying areas of Bray. So this is a map of Bray. On the left you can see just the extraction regionally. So Dublin Bay slightly to the north. The red square surrounds the physical location of Bray. And the blue line is the river running through the town, and there's some landmarks there, Super Quinn People's Park, for those of you who are familiar with it, on the golf course just on the north side adjacent to the coast. So this is that area highlighted with the outline is the 1986 flood extent from Hurricane Charlie, modelled from that period of time. So in terms of a flood relief scheme that's been proposed and emerged since, the one has been designed and planned, and it was approved by Board Penola in August 2008. Incidentally, an emergency flood plan was employed quite recently in September 2008, so just gives a little bit of background around recent events. So it was intended to progress this plan. However, there was ongoing media speculation throughout 2011 regarding the likelihood of the scheme progressing, and this is important in the context of some of the questions we subsequently asked about, for example, people's willingness to contribute towards a future flood defence, so personally pay out of their own pocket towards one. So there was uncertainty about whether the state would definitely proceed with the scheme. So funding was reviewed in 2011, so there was some degree of uncertainty. Funding allocated in January 2012, that should be 2012, and the contracts were signed just last month, and works are now pending. So the works comprise of river works and riverside works, so degree of containment and flood walls, for example. So the survey was undertaken between August and September 2011, so just last summer, during that period where there was local media speculation as to the likelihood of the scheme definitely progressing. So we targeted the population of the flood zone and its environs. We got 305 respondents from about 1,500 properties within the 1986 floodplain and within 150 metres of the floodplain. So it's about 20%. So we gathered information on their perceptions of flooding, risk, preparedness, awareness, responsibility, who is responsible, insurance and willingness to pay. And Finbar will deal with the majority of those. I'm just going to talk about perceptions firstly. So we asked all 305 respondents to map what they perceived to be the flood zone. So thinking about the Dargle River here in Bray, this is the question we asked. Could you outline as accurately as possible on this map the likely extent of the area you believe would be affected by severe flood? For example, a flood similar in scale to that of Hurricane Charlie in 1986. And I think there was about 20% of the respondents lived through that period of time, or were resident, I should say, in Bray at that particular time. So these coloured blobs are essentially some of the responses in terms of what they perceived to be the flood zone, with 1986 being the benchmark of a major previous event. So just some of the different contributions from the various people who undertook the survey. So these are just some of the ones, and they're being overlaid on top of each other as I just move along through. Now there was 305, I'm just picking a sample of a few here. And as you can see, some from very small overlaps, some to be quite extensive, and some coincided quite exceptionally closely to what was the previous experience of flooding in Bray in 1986. This is a 2D density overlay, so it's the overlaps of all those perceptions. So the 305 perceptions all overlaid, and obviously the increase in colour, or the intensity of the colour, is indicative of the rising density. So fortunately there's increasing density within the flood zone area. There's quite a decline towards the margins, however, but in general there is a degree of awareness about risk, a perception of the risk, and most commonly within the concentrated area around People's Park and Superquin, and it declines towards the coast and away from People's Park. And here's a 3D density overlay just to give an overview. So this is the topographical one where we all overlaid, the overlaps overlaid on top of each other. Unfortunately, we didn't include the flood zone extent, but that's just to give an illustrative of the various observations. So there's a reasonable degree of awareness of the flood zone, and Finbar is going to talk about various issues relating to preparedness and wider awareness and responsibility.
Thank you, Owen. So as Owen said, I'm going to talk about some of the more headline findings that that came out of the survey. So first of all, we were interested in the number of years that the people had been at their current address. The reason we're interested in that was because the last major flooding event was in 1986. So as you can see from this graph, there's quite a sizable amount of people who didn't live through that. And I think, as John mentioned when he was opening this session, that there's a lot of people who have never experienced a major flooding event, and I think that might have influenced some of the the findings that I will discuss later on. But so first of all, we were quite interested in, well, we're interested in people's attitudes to flood risk. But first of all, we wanted to find out what type of people they were in terms of risk taking. So 0 over on this side is people who do not like risk. They try and avoid risk. You've got your neutrals in the middle, and then you have your bungee jumpers and other such very, very major risk takers over here. So we thought that was an interesting to get people's attitudes to risk themselves before we went on to ask them about flooding specifically. So then we asked people, in general, thinking about where you live, would you say that your home is at risk of flooding? So you can see quite a sizable, almost 50% of people do think that their homes are at risk of flooding. Then we also asked them what they believe the actual source of that flooding was. And quite a sizable majority, about 75% of people who thought they were at risk of flooding thought it was from river flooding, as opposed to coastal or runoff or any other source. Then we actually wanted to gauge who has actually been affected by flooding. So we asked people, has the house or apartment that they lived in has ever been flooded? And as you can see, it's about 28% have actually experienced a flooding event in their lifetimes. And this is mainly in the Bray area. So we asked people if it wasn't this house or apartment complex, where was it? And the majority of those were in Bray. So people in our sample have experienced flooding in Bray. And it's also quite interesting that about 80% of these people, of this 28%, of those who have experienced flooding at some stage, it was from 1986 onwards. So the 1986, I think, is quite an interesting benchmark. Then we were interested in gauging, given the previous, the amount of people that have been flooded and the amount of people that perceive themselves to be at risk, how prepared are people for flooding. And so you get the range from haven't thought about it much to I am currently fully prepared. I think it's quite striking that it's less than 20% of our sample are actually currently prepared for flooding. And again, I think that this may come back to what John was saying, that most of the people just have not experienced a flooding event, but that's speculation on our part. Then we were kind of interested in what measures they'd gone to make themselves prepared. So from check flood information brochures or websites. So this includes the OPW flooding website. I think it's flooding.ie and floodmaps.ie. All the way down to installed flood-proof household measures. So these would include floodgates, toilet valves, sink valves, etc. And again, we thought it was quite interesting that the measures that actually required investment, so that you'd have to actually invest money in, that directly protected against flooding, came very, very low down the list. So as you can see, some of the more checking your insurance cover and checking the websites, obviously it doesn't incur a financial cost. Then we thought this question was quite interesting, and I think Roisin might have some information like this as well in her presentation later. But we were interested in who people would go to or contact first in the event of an emergency, specifically in terms of flooding. So you can see quite a range of different. We had more categories than this, and people were asked, gave more categories. But this is how it panned out. So you can see the majority of people going to their local authority. Some people going to the fire service, some to the Gardaí, and then we just asked people straight out. We didn't distinguish between what we would consider as the more informal or social. So family, friends, neighbours, so not a government agency. So then people who said this, who responded in this way, we asked them again this question, specifically about the government or more formal authority that they will go to. And this is what the red figure is of these respondents. It's almost about 100 respondents, so you can see the breakdown is almost the actual responses as well. So we thought that was quite interesting. The other, in the informal category, mainly refer to people who said, I wouldn't contact anyone, I'd rely on myself. And again, we thought that was quite interesting. It's about 20 or so respondents wouldn't actually contact anybody, would just rely on their own resources. So the international literature has shown a lot of different results in terms of responsibility. So if you look at the UK, it's generally people say themselves, the householder. I think at the presentation I was at in Galway last week on a similar flooding subject organised by one of our future speakers today. They show the comparison between the UK and Ireland. And Ireland, similar to the figures we found, an awful lot of people with a responsibility with the government or with the local authorities. These people who say themselves or their insurance company tend to be owner-occupiers or owning with a mortgage, as opposed to, say, local authority tenants or private tenants. We're also interested in insurance coverage. Thought it was quite interesting. We asked people, do you have household insurance at present that covers you specifically against flooding? So we asked specifically on the flooding issue. And as you can see, it's quite a substantial amount of people either don't or don't know whether they have insurance that covers themselves against flooding. We also asked their premiums in terms of the price they pay for flooding, and we found the mean to be €481 was the mean, with a standard deviation of about 173. I thought that was quite interesting, 481, because that's exactly the amount I pay myself for my own insurance. But then, for some of the people, for these people who couldn't get cover, it was only 15% of people, but we asked those whether they would be willing to invest in household flood protection measures to get cover or get a reduction in their premium. So these people were specifically asked whether they would invest in those household measures to get cover. And half of those, it's about a subsample of 50, so about 25 respondents said that they would be willing to invest to get cover. These are people who can't, who said no, that they couldn't get cover. We thought again that was quite an interesting finding. And it's also, I think, interesting that there's quite a low level of concern among some people. So these people were just not particularly concerned about flooding. And again, it may come back to this fear issue. The last thing that we asked people about was their willingness to pay for flood defences. And so to give you an idea, that at the time, as Owen said, of this, that this survey went ahead, there was much uncertainty about the actual, about the scheme going ahead. So there was absolutely no certainty that the Bray flood relief scheme would be going ahead. And we asked people, we gave them a scenario, we gave them the likely cost, 25 million, we gave them the likely cost per Bray household, which included people in and outside the flood zone, of €3,000 per household if everybody was to pay. I think it's very, very interesting that, as you can see, almost half of the respondents in our sample were willing to pay or contribute in principle to a flood relief scheme in Bray, with the average willingness to pay of those who were willing to pay. So this is just the sample that were actually willing to pay, €231 per annum over 5 years. So it was over a 5-year period was the scenario we gave people. So wrapping up very quickly, there's a heightened flood risk, as Owen has pointed out and other speakers. The most likely cause is climate change. In our sample, about 1/3 of respondents have experienced some level of flooding, with almost half believing that their home is at risk of flooding, and their perceptions, the people's perceptions of the flood area, tend to be very, very similar to the actual historic flood zone. It may be, it's kind of centred around the river, but what we found is relatively low levels of preparedness for a flood event, and the majority of people believing that the clean-up and cost of the flood lies beyond themselves, beyond the householder. We thought it was quite interesting again that, as you can see, 47% of people willing to pay in principle for a flood relief scheme. As Owen has said, though, that flood relief scheme is now has been confirmed and the works are pending at the moment. So thank you very much.
Again, a very interesting talk. I think it builds on some of the issues that Ian spoke about in the last presentation. And one of the things that sort of resonates with me there is that when you look at some of the numbers of the percentage of the people who actually take some sort of actions to increase their own resilience, they're incredibly low. And I think it sort of presents a question that needs to be addressed, probably from a social science perspective, in that, you know, engaging the public and empowering them to take ownership of the flood risk is a key element to increasing resilience in the context of these flood risk management approaches that are currently being adopted.